Harlem, August 14, 1946, 125th Street. Vincent Mangano burned 3 jazz clubs in one night, 8 musicians, 4 minutes. 0 survivors left standing. Snipers didn't do it. Bombers didn't do it. A matchstick and a message did. This wasn't destruction. It was a calculated attempt to erase Bumpy Johnson without touching him. 3 blocks of Harlem turned to ash. Bumpy never pulled a trigger back. To understand why, we go back to the night the money stopped moving. Harlem in 1946 didn't sleep. It breathed. From sundown to sunrise, 125th Street pulsed with something the rest of New York couldn't manufacture: a living, sweating, electric rhythm that came from the clubs, from the horns, from the bodies pressed together on dance floors slick with spilled whiskey and ambition. The Cotton Club was gone by then, swallowed by downtown money and white tourism. But what replaced it was rawer, hungrier, and infinitely more dangerous. These were black-owned rooms, black musicians, black money, and for the first time in a generation, black control. Every club on Lenox Avenue paid protection. That was the understood language of New York. In 1946 you paid, or you burned. The question was never whether to pay. The question was always, who do you pay? For years, the answer had been Brooklyn. Vincent Mangano ran the Mangano crime family with the cold efficiency of a man who believed New York was a table, and every neighborhood was a dish to be consumed. Harlem was his dessert suite, reliable, and never once allowed to speak back. Club owners received weekly visits from men in good suits carrying bad intentions. The numbers were non-negotiable. The consequences were not discussed, because they didn't need to be. Everyone already knew. Then Ellsworth Raymond Johnson came home. Bumpy Johnson had done federal time. The courts had been thorough. The sentences serious, but what no prison could extract from him was the architecture of his thinking. He returned to Harlem in the mid-1940s, not as a broken man, but as something more dangerous, a patient one. He walked the streets slowly. He visited every club. He sat with the owners' men named Calvin and Dexter and Roosevelt, and he listened. Not to their complaints, to their math. What he heard made his jaw tighten. Mangano was extracting 40% of gross revenue from clubs that were barely clearing their costs. Musicians were being paid last, if at all. 3 owners on 133rd Street had taken loans from Brooklyn intermediaries to cover the protection payments, which meant they now owed Mangano money on top of the weekly tribute. It was a trap built from arithmetic, and it had been snapping shut for years. "You're not paying for protection," Bumpy told Calvin Moore, owner of the Blue Horn Lounge, one Tuesday evening in early 1946. He set down his coffee cup carefully, the way a man does when he wants his next words to land without distraction. "You're paying for the privilege of being robbed slowly instead of all at once. There's a difference, but not much of one." Calvin looked at the table. "And what do we do about it?" "You stop doing it alone." What Bumpy proposed was not complicated, but in 1946 Harlem, it was revolutionary. He would organize the club owners into a collective, a single body that negotiated as one, paid as one, and refused as one. No individual owner would ever again face a Brooklyn collector without the weight of the entire network behind him. The protection payments would be consolidated, reduced, and redirected toward a community fund that paid for actual security men who lived in Harlem, answered to Harlem, and had no loyalty to any family in Brooklyn or anywhere else. He visited 11 clubs in 3 weeks. He brought no weapons to these meetings. He brought ledgers. He showed each owner exactly how much they had paid Mangano over the previous 5 years. He showed them the compound interest on their loans. He showed them what those same dollars could have built a new stage at the Savoy. a recording studio on 7th Avenue, a medical fund for the musicians who were slowly destroying their lungs for $20 a night. The numbers were not contested. They couldn't be. They were real. By February of 1946, 9 of the 11 clubs had agreed. The 2 who refused were visited again the following week. Not by Bumpy, but by their own neighbors, their own musicians, their own bartenders, men who had watched their community bleed money into Brooklyn for a decade and understood, in the blunt language of self-preservation, that this was the only offer worth taking. By March, the collective was complete. Word reached Brooklyn within days. In the world Mangano operated, information moved faster than money and almost as reliably. His response was not immediate. That was the first sign that he understood the threat more clearly than anyone in Harlem anticipated. A man who reacts immediately is a man who is angry. A man who waits is a man who is calculating. Mangano waited 6 weeks before he made his first move, and when he did, it was surgical. A numbers runner named Percy Dale was picked up off the street on a Wednesday morning and returned to his family that same evening. He was uninjured. He carried a single message, delivered verbally, which he repeated word for word to Bumpy Johnson that night at the back of a jazz club on 136th Street. The message was, "Tell him Brooklyn remembers who built these streets." Bumpy listened to Percy deliver the message. He nodded once. He poured 2 glasses of bourbon, gave one to Percy, and said nothing for a long time. The saxophone on the other side of the wall played something low and mournful, the kind of melody that sounds like a warning if you're listening for one. Then Bumpy said, "Brooklyn didn't build anything. Brooklyn just learned how to collect rent on somebody else's foundation." He sent no reply to Mangano. That silence, the kind that old Harlem still remembers the weight of, was itself a declaration. The old men on 135th Street still say everything started with the ledgers that disappeared. Not the clubs, not the fires, the ledgers. Because when those books vanished, Mangano lost his count, and a man who can't count what he owns is already losing it. Real power belongs to the last man collecting in the room. The club was called the Amber Room. It sat on the corner of 133rd and 7th Avenue, 40 seats, a bar that leaned slightly to the left, and a piano that had been tuned so many times the keys had developed opinions. It was owned by a man named Dexter Holt, who had operated it for 11 years without a single night of serious trouble. Dexter was 61 years old, moved slowly, smiled easily, and kept meticulous records in a green ledger stored beneath the floorboard behind the bar. On the morning of April 3rd, 1946, at approximately 4:15 a.m., 4 men came through the rear entrance. They were not subtle. They didn't need to be. They worked with the kind of efficiency that only comes from practice: overturned tables, shattered bottles. The piano dragged from its corner and dropped on its side so that when the strings snapped, they snapped loud. A sound like a gunshot fired inside a church. They found the green ledger beneath the floorboard. They knew exactly where to look and burned it in the kitchen sink. They left the cash register untouched. That last detail was deliberate. Mangano's men understood the difference between robbery and communication. This was communication. Dexter Holt arrived at 6 a.m. and stood in the doorway for a full 2 minutes before he could make himself walk inside. The piano lay on its side like a body. Glass covered every surface. The smell of burned paper still hung in the air, the smell of 11 years of careful record-keeping, reduced to carbon. He called Bumpy Johnson from the payphone on the corner at 6:17 a.m. Bumpy arrived 40 minutes later, moving with the unhurried precision of a man who had already decided how he was going to feel before he saw what he was about to see. He walked through the room once without speaking. He crouched beside the piano and ran one finger along the broken strings. The touch produced a sound so faint it was almost not a sound at all, just a vibration. Something between music and a dying breath. Then he stood, straightened his coat, and said, "Nobody touches anything. Nobody talks to the police more than necessary. And nobody retaliates. Not one person. Not one move." Dexter stared at him. "Bumpy, they destroyed my place. I know what they did. My ledger is ash. My piano is dead. My musicians have nowhere to play tonight." "I know." Bumpy's voice was flat, almost surgical. "And that's exactly what Mangano wants you to feel right now. He wants you loud and he wants you stupid. He wants you to swing back so he can bring 30 men into Harlem and call it a response." He looked at Dexter the way a man looks at something he intends to protect. "We are not going to give him that reason. What the police report filed that morning called a commercial disturbance, cause undetermined." The officer spent 11 minutes in the building, asked 4 questions, wrote down answers that had nothing to do with Brooklyn. The people on that block described in language that no official record would ever contain. They knew what it was. They had seen this before, in other neighborhoods, in other decades. They knew how it ended when the people being squeezed fought back on the other man's terms. Bumpy spent the following week doing something that looked, from the outside, like nothing. He visited his usual locations. He ate his usual meals. He played cards Thursday evening with the same 3 men he always played with. He appeared, to anyone watching, like a man who had absorbed the hit and continued walking. This was a performance, and it was flawless. Internally, he was building a map not on paper, because paper could be found, but inside his head, which had always been his most secure vault. He tracked every Mangano operative who had been seen in Harlem in the previous 30 days. He noted which bars they used, which corners they stood on, which women they visited, how long they stayed, what time they left. He was not preparing to attack. He was preparing to understand. A man who hits back the same day is a man who hasn't thought yet, he told Percy Dale one evening, turning a glass of bourbon slowly in his hand. "Mangano wants me to react. I'm going to make him wait until he forgets what he's waiting for." 3 weeks later, Mangano sent a second message. This time, it wasn't furniture. It was a musician. A saxophone player named Leonard Briggs was found on the morning of April 28th on the steps of the 135th Street Library. 3 fingers broken on his right hand. Clean breaks. Professionally done. He was alive. He would never play professionally again. Beside him was a note unsigned, printed in block letters that read, "The next message plays louder." When Bumpy heard about Leonard Briggs, he was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet a room gets when the temperature drops without warning. Then he said, "Now I know exactly what kind of man we're dealing with." He meant it not as fear, but as diagnosis. A man who destroys furniture sends a financial message. A man who breaks a musician's fingers sends something else entirely, a message about identity, about what a community values most, about the specific and calculated cruelty of destroying a man's purpose rather than his property. Bumpy understood then that Mangano wasn't trying to negotiate. He was trying to humiliate. And humiliation, in Bumpy Johnson's world, was the one currency that always collected interest. In this world, restraint is sometimes read as weakness. Bumpy Johnson understood that. He was counting on it. By May of 1946, Harlem had a nervous system. It had no name, no organizational chart, no membership roles, no hierarchy that any outside eye could trace. But it existed as surely as the elevated train that shook the windows on Lenox Avenue every 12 minutes, felt before it was seen, heard before it arrived. its presence woven into the daily rhythm of the neighborhood until it became indistinguishable from the neighborhood itself. Bumpy Johnson had built an intelligence network from the people that power always ignores. The musicians were first. They moved between clubs every night, crossing invisible territorial lines with their instrument cases and their cigarettes, carrying knowledge the way they carried sheet music without thinking about it, because it was simply part of what you accumulated doing this work. A saxophone player working 4 clubs in a single week saw things. He noticed faces that didn't belong. He registered the particular stillness of a man pretending not to watch. He understood, with the room-reading instinct of someone who had spent his career performing for strangers, when a presence meant something. Bumpy didn't ask them to become informants. That word carried weight none of them wanted. He asked them to remember. There was a difference, and it mattered. He told them if something feels wrong. You tell me, or you tell Percy. That's all. You don't approach anyone. You don't ask questions. You remember. And you tell someone who needs to know. The taxi drivers were next. In 1946, the cabs of Harlem functioned as an informal census of the neighborhood's movements, who was arriving from where, which hotels were receiving men who didn't fit any obvious category, which addresses were pulling unusual traffic at unusual hours. Bumpy had 3 drivers feeding him information by June. Men who understood without being told that what they were doing carried risk. And who did it anyway, because Bumpy had made clear, in the way he always made things clear without speeches, without ceremony, that Harlem's survival was not an abstraction. The third layer was the women who worked the floors and the back rooms of the clubs. This part of the network was never discussed openly. Not then and not in the years that followed, partly out of the particular silence that surrounded women's labor in that era, and partly because those women understood better than anyone that their value lay precisely in being underestimated. Mangano's men talked in front of them the way men have always talked in front of people they've decided don't matter freely, carelessly, with the arrogance of those who mistake invisibility for absence. They discussed logistics over drinks, argued about schedules while waiting for their coats, used the clubs as informal meeting rooms because the music was loud and the atmosphere felt, falsely, like cover. It was not cover. It was a recording. By the end of May, Bumpy knew the name, schedule, and at least one personal vulnerability of every Mangano operative working north of 110th Street. He knew which 2 were skimming from their own collections. He filed that information in the vault behind his eyes and left it there, untouched, because a man's weaknesses are worth more stored than spent. Mangano's collector, a meticulous man named Caruso, who had handled the Harlem accounts for years, noticed the change first. The payments were still arriving. The amounts were correct. But the access had changed where Caruso's men had previously walked directly to the club owners. They now found themselves meeting intermediaries, polite men, reasonable men, men who had no information to give and no authority to negotiate, and who were, by every visible measure, simply doing their jobs. The direct line to the club owners had been severed. Quietly, without announcement, Caruso filed a report. He described it as an inconvenience. He did not understand yet that what he was describing was architecture. Mangano understood it better. He had been in this business long enough to know that a man who restructures his access points is a man who is preparing for something he hasn't shown you yet. He called his lieutenants together on a Saturday night in June, in a back room in Brooklyn that smelled of cigarette smoke and old wood. Johnson is building something, he told them. By the time it's visible, it'll already be done. Then we move now. We tried that. The club. The musician. He didn't answer. He's afraid. Mangano shook his head slowly. A frightened man makes noise. Johnson is making silence. He looked at the table. A man who makes silence is a man who has already decided what he's waiting for. He was right. Bumpy had identified the moment months earlier. He was simply waiting for Mangano to manufacture it because the most defensible power is the power that responds, that can point to the provocation, that arrives after the first move has already been made by someone else. 3 times in June, Mangano's men crossed into Harlem with instructions to deliver another message. 3 times they found their targets relocated, their routes anticipated. The neighborhood arranged against them in ways they couldn't see or name. They returned to Brooklyn with reports that contained no incidents, no confrontations, nothing that could be written down as a failure. But Mangano read them as failures anyway, because he understood what their emptiness meant. Harlem had eyes he couldn't locate and ears he couldn't buy. In August, he burned 3 jazz clubs, not because it was a good move, because it was the only move he had left. When a powerful man destroys what he cannot control, it is not strategy, it is confession. The fires were the confession of a man who had exhausted his surgical options and reached for something blunt, something visible, something that would force a reaction because nothing else had. What Mangano did not know what he could not have known, because no informant inside his organization had ever been inside the network Bumpy built, was that the clubs had been cleared of people within 90 seconds of the first sign of smoke. Someone had been watching the men with the matches since they crossed the bridge. The musicians got out, the staff got out, the owners got out. The buildings burned. Harlem did not, investigators later noted, in records that took decades to surface through municipal archives, that the speed of the evacuation was inconsistent with an unwarned response. No official explanation was ever offered for how so many people moved so quickly from 3 separate locations on the same night. The people who lived through it didn't need an explanation. They already knew. Any neighborhood that breathes as one is nearly impossible to destroy, because by the time the fire arrives, the people are already gone. The first club ignited at 2:17 a.m. The Blue Horn Lounge on 133rd Street went up fast, too fast for a building that had stood 40 years in Harlem rain and summer heat. The fire didn't crawl the way fires crawl through old wood. It detonated. One moment the windows were dark. The next they were orange, glass exploding outward onto the sidewalk in a sound like a dozen pistols fired simultaneously. Shards spinning through the lamplight like broken teeth shaken from a jaw. 17 seconds later, the Amber Room burned. 40 seconds after that, the Velvet Gate on Lenox Avenue 3 blocks north, an impossible distance for any single fire to travel, erupted from its basement upward. The explosion lifting the front door off its hinges and depositing it in the middle of the street where it lay burning quietly. Like a eulogy nobody had the words for. 3 locations. 1 night. Timed with the precision of men who had rehearsed this. By the time Bumpy Johnson reached 133rd Street, the fire trucks were already positioned, which told him something that the fire itself hadn't. The firehouses had been called before the buildings lit. Not by much, but enough. Whoever made those calls had known the sequence. The spacing, the exact minute each location would go. He stood on the sidewalk across from the Blue Horn and watched it consume itself. The heat pressed against his face from 30 feet away like a hand that wouldn't move. The smell was surgical in its specificity, burning wood, burning leather from the bar stools, burning felt from the pool table, and underneath all of it, sharp and chemical and unmistakable, the bite of something that had no business being in a jazz club. Gasoline, not a splash, a deliberate, professional quantity. Percy Dale materialized at his shoulder. His face had gone the color of old concrete. Calvin got out, his bartender. The musicians were already clear. Bumpy nodded once, without moving his eyes from the fire. How many people knew the guard rotation? In the network, Percy calculated quietly, maybe 12, 15. And how many knew the exact schedule, which club, which night, which man at which door? The pause before Percy answered was its own kind of answer. 7. 8 at most. Bumpy said nothing. He watched a section of the Blue Horn's roof fold inward, sending a column of sparks spiraling upward into the August dark like a signal fire built for an audience that hadn't arrived yet. The crowd on the sidewalk made a sound collective, involuntary. The sound a neighborhood makes when it understands that something permanent has just been taken from it. By morning, Harlem had a new vocabulary for the night. 3 clubs gone, not damaged gone, reduced to black timber and shattered glass and the particular smell that lingers for weeks after a serious fire, working its way into the brickwork of every building on the block, into the clothes of everyone who lived nearby, into the memory of a neighborhood that had already survived too much to be surprised, but wasn't yet numb enough not to grieve. The economic destruction was severe. The symbolic destruction was worse. The Blue Horn had been serving Harlem since 1931. The Amber Room since 1935. These weren't just buildings. They were the architecture of what the neighborhood understood itself to be, the rooms where bebop had been invented and reinvented, where men and women who worked brutal jobs during the day came at night to remember that beauty was still possible, and Bumpy Johnson had promised to protect them. He held a meeting that morning above a barber shop on 125th Street. 12 men around a table too small for the weight of what was being discussed. A single window throwing pale light that nobody looked at. The faces ranged from shattered to incandescent, and the incandescent ones were getting louder. Roosevelt Webb put both hands flat on the table and leaned forward until the wood creaked. We restructured everything you told us to restructure. We cut Brooklyn out the way you said. We trusted the network. His voice was the controlled voice of a man who has decided that restraint is the most threatening thing available to him. And I am sitting here looking at the ash of 11 years of my brother's life. So tell me, with precision, why I should not go to Brooklyn tonight. Because Mangano has already written your next move for you, Bumpy said. He was standing. He never sat when he needed a room to listen. He didn't burn those clubs to hurt us financially. He burned them to put a gun in your hand. He wants you in Brooklyn tonight. He wants the bodies. He wants the police response. He wants the commission to look at Harlem and see a neighborhood that solves problems with fire and funerals. He moved his eyes around the table slowly, the way a man moves a flashlight through a dark room. We start shooting. We don't lose the clubs. We lose everything else. Roosevelt stared at him for a long time. Then what do? We find out who gave Mangano the schedule. The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something unspeakable has been made speakable. Bumpy spent the next 72 hours doing the only thing that had ever reliably told him the truth. He followed money. Not the visible money. Not the collection routes and payment ledgers that Mangano's accountants maintained, but the invisible money. The currency that moves in coat pockets and through handshakes and leaves traces in the bureaucratic paperwork that institutions generate without understanding. Delivery manifests, fuel requisitions, the paper trail of a significant quantity of gasoline that had to originate somewhere. What he found through channels that operated in the permanent shadows between law enforcement and organized crime. The gray territory where information has always moved most freely was a delivery routed through a Queens warehouse, paid through an intermediary company that ceased to exist within 2 weeks of the fires. The company had been registered by someone whose name Bumpy recognized immediately. Not a Brooklyn face, not a Mangano soldier. Someone who had been inside Bumpy's own rooms, someone who had nodded at the right moments, asked the right questions, and carried the guard schedules in his head alongside everything else he knew. Bumpy folded the information and put it somewhere no one could search. He told no one. He went home, slept 4 hours, and returned to 125th Street the following morning, looking like a man who had made his peace with whatever came next. Because an empire can be rebuilt after fire, stone by stone, dollar by dollar, reputation by reputation. What neither stone nor dollar nor reputation can survive what dissolves the foundation before the structure above it even notices is the discovery that the match was struck from inside. The old men who lived through that August will tell you the fires burned hot. What they won't tell you, what some of them still find too close to say out loud, is that the worst heat came from the room above the barber shop. When 12 men looked at each other and understood that one of them already knew this was coming, Bumpy Johnson did not confront the man. That was the move anger demanded, and anger, in his experience, was the most expensive advisor a man in his position could consult. He had the name. He had the paper trail. Thin as cigarette paper, but legible to anyone who knew how to read that particular language. He sat across from the man at 2 separate meetings in the week following the fires, looked directly into his face, listened to him speak about next steps and contingencies and rebuilding, and showed nothing, not a degree of temperature change, not a millimeter of tension around the jaw. A guilty man watching for signs of discovery is extraordinarily sensitive. The absence of any sign is itself information. It tells him he has not been found, which makes him relax, which makes him sloppy. Bumpy needed him sloppy. The man's name has never appeared in a confirmed document from that period. What survives in the oral history of a neighborhood that kept its own records in the currency of memory rather than paper is the shape of him. Someone Bumpy had known for years, not an acquaintance, not a peripheral member of the network. Someone who had been present at foundational conversations, who understood the architecture of the collective from the inside, who had been trusted with the kind of operational information that only moves between people who have earned the right to carry it. He had been carrying it to Brooklyn. The mechanism was not crude. It had been engineered by someone with patience and a sophisticated understanding of how to extract information from a close-knit organization without triggering the antibodies that close-knit organizations develop against exactly this kind of intrusion. The guard rotations had not been delivered in a single transaction that would have been visible. Traceable. The kind of transfer that leaves a shape in the negative space of an investigation. They had moved in fragments over weeks. Small pieces of operational detail, each one individually explainable, collectively forming a complete map of exactly when each club would be most exposed. Mangano had not bought a traitor. He had grown one. The distinction mattered to Bumpy in a way that was more than academic. A bought man can be outbid or frightened into stillness. A grown man, a man who had been slowly cultivated, given grievances to water, made to feel that his contributions had been consistently undervalued by the people he was serving, that man has constructed a moral architecture around his betrayal. He believes he has reasons. He will keep operating, keep delivering, keep justifying himself to himself, which meant he would stay in place, and a man who stays in place can be used. Bumpy constructed 3 false rotation schedules, 3 distinct versions of the following month's guard assignments, each one containing a single unique detail that appeared nowhere else, each one delivered to a different subset of people within the network. He told no one he had done this. He simply inserted the false information into the natural flow of operational communication, with the casual offhandedness of a man performing routine administration. And then he waited. 9 days. On the 9th day, a Mangano operative was observed repositioning himself outside a club that, according to one specific false schedule, would have had its door unguarded on a particular Tuesday evening. The club had 3 men inside and 2 across the street, which the operative discovered by standing on the corner for 38 minutes before concluding that something had gone wrong with his information. He left. He made no move. He had no reason to. But he had already answered every question Bumpy needed answered. The specific version of the false schedule that had moved confirmed not just the source but the channel, how the information traveled. How quickly, through how many hands before it reached Brooklyn. Bumpy traced that channel backward with the methodical precision of a man who had spent his life navigating systems designed to obscure their own workings. What he found at the far end of the channel reframed everything. Mangano's objective was not territorial. It had never been purely territorial. The money mattered. It always mattered. But the sustained campaign of infiltration, the patience invested in cultivating a source inside the network, the selection of targets designed to maximize symbolic damage rather than financial damage, all of it pointed to something more specific than a neighborhood takeover. He was engineering a story in which Bumpy Johnson's network was permeable, his judgment compromised, his promise of protection revealed as a confidence the neighborhood had extended to a man who couldn't keep it. A story that, once established in the minds of Harlem's club owners and community leaders, would accomplish what no number of broken pianos or burned buildings could accomplish. It would make the collective dismantle itself. Because the collective's foundation was not money or muscle, but the singular belief that Bumpy Johnson's word was worth building on. He wasn't coming for Harlem, Bumpy told Percy Dale weeks later, in a tone so flat, and even that Percy would remember it decades afterward as the voice of a man who had looked at something genuinely dangerous and refused to blink. He was coming for the reason Harlem listens to me. Take that and the rest surrenders without a fight. The betrayer was excised from the network that same week. No confrontation, no accusation delivered in a room full of witnesses. He was simply no longer included, removed from the information flow so quietly, so completely, that he continued appearing at meetings for 2 weeks before the full shape of his exclusion became clear to him. By then, it didn't matter. The channel was closed. The network had already rebuilt itself around the gap he'd left, the way a living thing grows around a wound. He never went to Brooklyn with what he knew. The specific reasons he didn't have never been established with certainty, which is perhaps the most honest way that story can end. Some silence don't have clean explanations, only consequences. And the consequence of his silence was that Harlem never had to decide what to do about a public betrayal. No bullet in that world traveled as far or hit as clean as betrayal, delivered by someone who knew which rooms you trusted. The men who survived that era understood this not as wisdom, but as scar tissue. Bumpy Johnson did not reach for a gun. This was the move that confused people, and the people it confused most were the ones closest to him. Which was the specific kind of confusion that keeps a leader awake at 3 in the morning, listening to a city that won't stop generating noise. 3 clubs burned, a traitor found and excised, the credibility of the collective visibly shaken before a neighborhood that had extended its trust in a single direction, and was now watching that direction carefully for signs of having miscalculated. Curtis Webb, younger, faster, possessed of the particular certainty that belongs to men who haven't yet accumulated enough loss to make them careful, came to Bumpy on a Wednesday night in early September and sat down without waiting to be invited. He put his hands on the table the way men put their hands on tables when they want you to understand that the hands are available for other purposes. "The men are ready," Curtis said. "We know the routes. We know the addresses. Say the word and Brooklyn learns tonight what Harlem costs." Bumpy looked at him steadily. "How many of our men don't come home from that operation?" Curtis recalculated behind his eyes. 3, maybe 4. And Mangano replaces his losses in a week, and the commission looks at what happened and sends representatives to Harlem to establish order, which means we're not dealing with one family anymore. We're dealing with all of them. Bumpy let that sit for a moment, the way you let something heavy settle before you ask someone to look at it clearly. You want to win the fight tonight, or win the situation. Curtis left without answering. But he didn't move independently, which was the only answer that mattered. What Bumpy did instead was something that Mangano's organization built on a grammar of physical consequence, fluent in the language of bodies and buildings, and visible demonstrations of force was structurally unable to read until it was already happening to them. He cut the liquor first. A significant portion of the alcohol moving through Harlem's smaller clubs, the volume product. The stock that kept the margins alive on slow Tuesday nights traveled through distribution networks that followed far enough back through layers of legitimate business and quiet arrangement, connected to Brooklyn suppliers with Mangano affiliations. These weren't dramatic criminal relationships. They were the invisible infrastructure of how commerce worked in that world, sustained not by anyone's deliberate choice but by the inertia of arrangements that had been in place long enough to become the default condition of doing business. Bumpy spent 2 weeks redirecting those supply lines. He identified 3 alternative distributors, 2 out of New Jersey, 1 from Philadelphia who could match the Brooklyn product on price and exceed it on delivery reliability. He made no announcement. He issued no ultimatum. He simply converted the accounts, club by club, with the patience of a man who understands that the most effective pressure is the kind the other person doesn't recognize as pressure until they've already absorbed most of it. By the time the volume drop reached Mangano's desk as a formal accounting problem, the Harlem revenue line was already down 30% from the previous month. His supplier had been filing weekly reports describing the decline as a market fluctuation. It was not a market fluctuation. The numbers operation came next. The illegal lottery that networked through every neighborhood in New York, generating the daily cash that fed the protection economy, from the bottom up had always included Brooklyn runners working Harlem routes. These were men whose presence in the neighborhood was so routine, so embedded in the rhythm of daily life, that they had become functionally invisible. They collected in the mornings, paid out in the afternoons, moved through blocks with the practiced ease of people who belong to a place even when the place doesn't belong to them. Bumpy didn't move against the runners. He moved against the reputation. Information began circulating through Harlem's internal channels, the same network that had cleared 3 clubs in 90 seconds that Brooklyn's operation had shorted payouts on 2 consecutive cycles. The figures cited were specific. The blocks named were real blocks. The conversations described were described with the texture of eyewitness testimony, the kind of detail that doesn't feel invented because invented detail is almost never that granular. Whether every element of those stories was precisely accurate is a question that the passage of time and the deliberate impermanence of that world make impossible to resolve. What is certain is that Brooklyn's numbers business in Harlem declined 40% in 3 weeks, not because anyone was threatened, but because customers began preferring runners who lived on their blocks, who had children in the same schools, who understood that their business survived only as long as their word did. The third cut was the one Bumpy had been saving. 2 of Mangano's lieutenants had been skimming their own collections. He had known this since May, had filed the information carefully in the vault, had resisted every opportunity to use it prematurely, because timing in that world was the difference between a killing blow and a wasted one. He exposed them now, not to law enforcement, not in any way that could be traced to Harlem, but to Mangano himself, anonymously, through channels that pointed unmistakably toward the inside of his own organization. The effect moved through the Mangano family like a current through water, invisible on the surface, total in its reach. 2 lieutenants pulled from operations, emergency meetings called. The cold-running machine of a family that had operated for years on the confidence that its internal loyalty was unquestionable, now generating exactly the friction that internal suspicion always produces slower decisions. Cross-checked communications, men watching each other in rooms where trust used to be assumed. Some financial records from this period surfacing decades later through civil proceedings, entirely unrelated to the original events. The way buried things surface when the ground shifts suggests that the Mangano family's Harlem revenue fell by more than 60% between August and November of 1946. 60%. No gunfire, no bodies, no single dramatic confrontation that either side could point to as the moment the balance shifted. Just the slow, methodical, patient application of pressure to every place where money entered Mangano's world from Harlem, until the pressure became undeniable and the silence around it became its own kind of statement. Percy Dale watched the numbers and said to Bumpy one October evening, "He can't absorb this much longer. A man in his position can't bleed quietly and keep the respect of the other families." "No," Bumpy said. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was always quiet before he said something he'd been thinking about for longer than the conversation suggested. "But there's a difference between a man who comes to the table because he wants to negotiate and a man who comes because he has nothing left to protect." He picked up his glass, set it down without drinking. "I want Mangano to walk into that room already knowing he lost. That's the only negotiation worth sitting down for. In rooms far from Harlem in Little Italy, in the Bronx, in the kind of establishments that didn't appear in any directory but were understood by everyone who needed to find them, the other families were watching the Harlem account go quiet with the focused attention of men whose own revenues were connected to the stability of the arrangements Mangano was visibly failing to maintain. The pressure that had begun as Bumpy's private strategy was becoming a structural problem for the entire New York underworld. And that, from the very beginning, had been the design. When money stops moving in that world, it doesn't just create a problem, it creates a vacuum. And vacuums in that business have always been filled by whoever was patient enough to wait at the edge while everyone else panicked toward the center. The neighborhood changed its sound after the fire. Not immediately. Harlem went quiet the way places go quiet after something irreversible. A held breath. Grief and rage arriving simultaneously and canceling each other into stillness. The clubs that survived stayed dark. Lenox Avenue at midnight felt like a street that had forgotten its purpose. Then the quiet cracked. At the edges first. Conversations outside barbershops climbing past the register of casual complaint. Young men on corners at 2 in the morning with nothing in their hands but intention. A church basement on 136th Street where a pastor who had preached restraint for 30 years stood before a full room and found, for the first time in his ministry, that he had nothing left to offer it. Curtis Webb had been quiet since his conversation with Bumpy. Quiet is not the same as still. By the second week of September, he had 14 men, specific routes, and a target, a Mangano warehouse in Red Hook that processed the family's Harlem accounting. The plan was not subtle. It was designed to produce a sound that Brooklyn could not ignore, and Harlem could not mistake for anything other than what it was. Bumpy found out on a Thursday. Percy Dale stood in the doorway above the barber shop with the expression of a man arriving late to something that has already developed its own gravity. Bumpy was at Curtis Webb's apartment by 7. Curtis opened the door and stepped back. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and the stale air of decisions already made. 2 men sat at the table and did not stand. "You're going to get 14 men killed," Bumpy said, "and when they're dead, Mangano brings the full family north and calls it a response, and Harlem stops being a neighborhood with a problem and becomes a war zone with no exits." Curtis looked at him with eyes that had been carrying weight for weeks. "He burned our clubs. He put Leonard Briggs on those library steps with 3 broken fingers, and he's still standing across the river like none of it reached him." His voice was flat in the way that voices go flat when the emotion behind them is burned down to something harder than feeling. "When does Harlem get to feel like it hit back?" "Tonight," Bumpy said, "if you let me do it correctly." He gave Curtis 72 hours. Curtis gave him the room. What Bumpy had identified through months of financial work was a physical cash reserve, the Mangano family's operational float for New York. kept not in any bank but in a safe, inside a garment district building behind a front business that had been serving that purpose since the late 1930s. $60,000 to $90,000. 1946 currency. Moving it would not destroy Mangano. It would do something more precise than destruction. It would humiliate him in front of his own people at the exact moment his management of Harlem was already being questioned by every family in New York. The operation lasted 11 minutes. 3 men. No violence. The specific method of entry lives now only in oral history, passed through back rooms and barbershops for decades. The details shifting slightly with each telling the way true things shift when memory carries them. What every version agrees on, the money moved cleanly, and a portion of it came back to Harlem enough to begin rebuilding what had burned on August 14th. No newspaper ran the story. Mangano absorbed the loss in silence, the silence of a man who cannot report what was stolen without explaining why it existed in that form, outside any legitimate accounting. But Harlem knew. The way it always knew the things that mattered, not through documentation, but through the shift in atmosphere that follows a change in the balance of power. Curtis Webb disbanded his 14 men without explanation. The neighborhood's temperature had changed, and men who live by temperature understand the reading without being told. Mangano made 2 phone calls that night. The second one reached a man whose name connected him to a level of the New York underworld that operated above individual family disputes. A man who had been watching from a distance since August and was now, for the first time, watching from much closer. One strike in the right place doesn't just take the money, it takes the story a man tells about himself. And in that world, the story is always worth more than the cash. The other families had been watching since August. In Vincent Mangano's world, observation was professional discipline, the continuous low-frequency intelligence work of organizations whose survival depended on accurately reading the men they shared a city with. When one family's revenue declined sharply without visible explanation for 3 consecutive months, the watching became something with edges. Albert Anastasia made the first formal move. His interest in the Harlem situation was precise and financial. Mangano's instability was creating friction in adjacent operations, delayed payments, uncertain commitments, the disorder that follows an organization under sustained stress. By October, Anastasia's patience had a specific expiration date. The meeting was held above a restaurant on Hester Street. 4 men. The owner had been asked to close early and had done so without requesting an explanation, because men in his position understood that certain requests already contained their own answer. Mangano arrived last. In that world, arriving last is a statement. Every man in the room read it. The reading produced irritation rather than deference, which told Mangano, if he was paying attention, exactly where he stood. Anastasia spoke without preparation. The Harlem situation is costing this table money. Not your table. This table. He let that distinction settle. We have arrangements that require stability in your northern operations. Those operations are not currently stable. The situation is being managed, Mangano said. It has been being managed since August. No heat in Anastasia's voice. Heat would have been easier to sit across from. A man with no family standing and no commission recognition has been reducing your revenue systematically for 3 months. The responses we've seen have produced noise without results. He placed both hands flat on the table. We're not here to assign fault. We're here to establish resolution. Tonight. The precise terms negotiated in that room have never appeared in any document. This is standard, not anomaly. The men who built those organizations had learned through decades of federal exposure that the most durable agreements live exclusively in the memories of the men who made them. Paper creates evidence. Memory, in the right hands, creates nothing a prosecutor can use. What Harlem's oral history preserves is the shape of the agreement. Mangano would withdraw his active operations from the neighborhood systematically, through decisions that could each be explained individually without their sum reading, in any visible record, as concession. In exchange, the financial pressure on his operations would cease. Bumpy Johnson was not in that room. He held no commission standing. He would never have been invited. But everything on that table carried his signature, every revenue line gone quiet. Every crack in Mangano's structure, every pressure point being negotiated had been designed and applied by a man whose name the men present were carefully not using, because naming him formally would have required acknowledging formally what he had accomplished. Anastasia understood this completely. Near the end of the meeting, in the only unguarded moment produced by several hours of careful conversation, he looked at Mangano with the steady patience of a man delivering a lesson he intends to stick. "Next time you send a message to a neighborhood," Anastasia said, "make sure the neighborhood doesn't already know how to write back." Mangano said nothing. It was the most honest response available to him. 4 men went down the stairs and into the cold October street and into separate cars. The restaurant owner heard the back door close and understood that whatever had been decided carried the particular finality of things. Decided at that level, no revision, no appeal, arriving in its own form on its own schedule. Bumpy Johnson had engineered a situation in which the commission of the New York underworld solved his problem without his presence at the table, without his formal participation, without his ever acknowledging that such a structure existed. He had made a private war into a structural inconvenience, and structural inconveniences in that world get resolved by the structure. The most important rooms have no windows, not to keep secrets in, but to keep the street from seeing who is and isn't at the table. By morning, the street feels the decision anyway. The Blue Horn Lounge reopened on a Friday night in November. Calvin Moore had spent 11 weeks overseeing the rebuilding, with the focused attention of a man who understands he is reconstructing more than a building. New bar, new floors, new piano, a Steinway, upright, purchased for cash from a midtown dealer on a Tuesday morning. The transaction completed in 20 minutes between 2 people who understood that certain purchases don't benefit from extended conversation. The walls went back to the same deep burgundy his wife had chosen in 1931. Calvin had considered updating the color. He decided against it, because some things are worth keeping exactly as they were. Leonard Briggs sat in the front row that first Friday. His right hand rested in his lap, the fingers healed into the crooked geometry of bones that set on their own terms after 3 clean breaks. He wore a good suit. He listened to the saxophone the way a man listens to a language he once spoke fluently and can no longer produce but still completely understands. The club was full by 9, standing room by 10. People who hadn't been inside a jazz club since August came back that Friday and kept coming, until Lenox Avenue recovered something that functioned like its old sound, not identical. Because nothing that survives what Harlem survived comes out unchanged, but alive and recognizably itself. Bumpy arrived late. He moved through the room without ceremony, accepted bourbon from Calvin, and sat in the back near the wall with the full room in front of him and nothing behind him but plaster. Old habit. In his world, the line between habit and survival had never been entirely clear. He had been offered a more conclusive resolution. This is the detail Harlem discussed in careful voices for years in the tones reserved for decisions that could have gone differently and whose different outcome would have rewritten everything following. Mangano was exposed, his commission standing damaged. The window for a permanent solution existed briefly in the fall of 1946 and then closed. The way windows in that world close on schedules that don't accommodate hesitation. Bumpy didn't walk through it. Removing a man is the simple part, he told Percy Dale that November. in the tone of someone explaining something he finished thinking about long before the conversation began. What grows in the space where he was, that's what people don't account for before they act, Percy said. Some would call that mercy. Bumpy looked at him with an expression that lived between amusement and something older. Some people would be describing the wrong thing entirely. Mangano's withdrawal arrived without announcement. A collection route quietly discontinued. A supplier relationship allowed to lapse. A runner reassigned without explanation. The capillaries of Brooklyn's presence in Harlem closing one by one over 6 weeks, until the system that had been extracting revenue from the neighborhood for years simply stopped functioning the way a machine stops when enough components have been quietly removed that the whole can no longer sustain its own operation. The club owners understood because they stopped receiving visits from men in good suits. The musicians understood because the ambient anxiety that had lived inside every performance since April, the awareness that the room might not exist next week, lifted, recognizable only in its absence. The neighborhood understood through atmosphere, through the changed quality of Lenox Avenue after dark. The way a street feels different when a weight has been removed from it. No flags, no declaration, no moment that any record could call surrender. The saxophone played. Calvin stood behind his new bar with his eyes closed. Leonard Briggs sat in the front row with his broken hand in his lap and his whole self inside the music. And Bumpy Johnson sat in the back, in the chair where nothing could come up behind him, and drank his bourbon slowly and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. Harlem had held. That was the entire statement. A man wise enough to win without declaring it leaves his enemy nothing to avenge, and history nothing clean to record, which means the truth survives only in the neighborhood that lived it. The jazz clubs burned. Then they were rebuilt. The saxophone came back to Lenox Avenue like it had never left, like the smoke, the broken glass. And the 11 weeks of silence had been nothing more than a bad dream that the music simply refused to remember. But Harlem knew what New York only heard as rumor. A neighborhood with no army, no commission standing, and no formal power had forced a mafia family to walk away. Not through firepower, through patience, intelligence, and the unbreakable will of a man who understood that the most dangerous weapon in any war is knowing exactly where the other side is most afraid to bleed. Bumpy Johnson never called it a victory. He called it survival. And in his world, survival was the only victory that compounded interest. The clubs still stand on Lenox Avenue today, different names, different faces, same streets. And if you listen carefully enough on a quiet November night, the saxophone still carries something that sounds less like music and more like a message that never finished being delivered. Stories like this one don't live in textbooks. They live here in the telling, in the remembering, in the people who refuse to let them disappear. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and stay close. There are more nights like this one waiting. More rooms with no windows where history was decided by men. History almost forgot. And before you go, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. If you were Bumpy Johnson that November night, with Mangano diminished and the window open, would you have taken the permanent solution? Or chosen the peace that kept the neighborhood breathing and looking back at everything he built without firing a single shot? Do you believe that kind of patience is still possible today? Or did it die with the men who practiced it?